Welcome to That's Where the Money Is, Funding a University Spinout. This is one in a series of webinars about technology commercialization through spinouts, or startups based on university-developed technology. I am David Overton, and I'm joined today by Christian Blackwell, a fellow partner at Opus Faveo Innovation Development.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you all could join us today.
We're focused on fundraising partly because it's a key step in creating a successful company, and also because it's a major challenge. As an example of how difficult it is, our recent survey of technology transfer executives showed that seed funding is rated as about the most important capability for supporting startups, and it's also rated as among the weakest. In general, universities appear to have invested in line with the importance of various capabilities, but seed funding is an exception, and it's one that we think should be addressed. And at the same time, there are ways that founders can overcome this weakness.
So this probably isn't a huge surprise to people. Certainly the importance, the capabilities might be. And this is really in line with much of what we saw in our survey results. There were a number of things that were confirming presuppositions we had before the survey, and then a number of little surprises embedded in there. And the capability here is probably the biggest surprise.
That's right. And the need is clearly there, and that early stage seed funding is generally the most difficult hurdle.
Yeah.
And then one example of underestimating the difficulty of fundraising, a point here from the CEO of Scripps.com. There's a superficial belief that funding may be readily available. And sometimes for companies that are farther along and can access venture capital funding, that may be true. But the truth for a new company is far from that, especially in that early seed round.
This definitely mirrors all of the experience that we've had looking at university spinouts. We've seen this over and over again.
One way we look at this is the idea of Sutton's Law. When he was asked why he robs banks, his response was, "That's where the money is." Basically, the idea here is first, consider the obvious. But in this case, and that rule often works, but in this case, nothing is obvious about raising funds, and thinking that it is can cause big mistakes. In many cases, what seems obvious about fundraising is the wrong answer. One obvious but incorrect assumption is that fundraising can start right away. Many would-be entrepreneurs start their thinking here and immediately start raising money before they're ready.
And of course, there's lots to be done before you ever get to that fundraising stage.
Right. One way we look at this is to look at the venture development process that we use at Opus Faveo Innovation Development. And that shows that there are a lot of steps that need to occur before fundraising. That includes extensive business planning and analysis, and understanding the competition, the actual demand or need for the product, and the industry dynamics of the business that you're going to be participating in. Our discussions with potential funders have shown that new startups are often unprepared for early stage fundraising because they haven't done their homework in these areas.
And this can be especially true for a university spinout. So what we encourage is that the university decide that this is something worth commercializing and turning into a spinout, and then looking to create programs, create capabilities within the institution to allow all of this to happen, so that by the time you get to actually approaching investors, things are pretty far along, and of course then you can get into the nitty-gritty of actually building a business. So why don't we talk for a minute about the uses of seed money. Again, there may not be huge surprises here. There really aren't any specific rules. It's something we often think about this in terms of value steps. So looking for a next step that will increase the value of the company and using the earliest funding, this seed round, to get you to that next stage. A number of things that one can focus on: determining the actual product, looking at the market, value prop, etc. I think it goes without saying, seed money is generally pre-revenue. Taking research from the lab and turning it into an actual prototype might be another specific use. Building out the team. Early products, again, that ties into that prototype and how you might define what the prototype is. We actually spend a lot of time in our companies, in our spin-outs, looking at what an actual prototype will look like. But I come back to the key here is not even so much we've got on here $1 million, under $1 million. These are all soft concepts. The real key here is to try to bracket out what the goal is for this first round of money, so that by the time you're approaching investors for the next round of capital, you've got something more in your company that bumps up the valuation.
Right, and that early seed funding is most often used to validate and demonstrate the technology and to get to a really tangible milestone that reduces risk and allows for establishing a better valuation for the company.
So this is said that some of this you may be aware of, some not. This is something that many of you may be aware of, but you probably need to revisit, because it's a super important concept, and it's one that we often gloss over, those of us who are in this startup and spin-out business, and we think it's really important. And particularly when we're talking to scientists, when we're looking at people who are not so squarely in the startup world, this is just a super important point to get across, and that is that you want to raise just enough money to get you to that next stage. And the reason is simply because it's the most expensive money, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. But the point is that early on, the money that you're raising costs you the most. You're having to give up the most equity because there's the most risk involved, and that valuation is key, and watching how that valuation grows is important.
A simple example might help to illustrate how this concept that Christian just mentioned works. In the seed round, valuation is very difficult because there's no product, there's typically no revenue, and the risk is at its highest level. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Investors will normally accept only a very low valuation at that point. And if you raise more than you need, you'll be giving away a larger part of the company. In this example, if we raise $500,000, a typical seed round amount, if we raise that in that initial going, we would have to give up half the company to get that. However, if we raise less initially and use that initial seed money to accomplish some key milestones, we validate the technology, we resolve open issues and reduce the risk, and then in a subsequent round we can raise funds at a higher valuation. And in this example, that means giving up 30% of the company while still ultimately raising the same amount of money.
So that brings us to the importance of being lean and being creative. Lean startup has been all over Silicon Valley and the startup world for the last few years. This idea that you can build a company with a minimum of capital. We at Opus Faveo are firm believers in this, because ultimately in being lean, you are able to preserve more of the company for the founders. In the case of a spin-out, that's going to be the university and most importantly, the scientists behind the technology. And it gives you more flexibility as you raise money. So it's always good to be raising money when you don't actually need it, and by being lean and having some of these principles embedded in your company, you have a lot more flexibility. When we look at venture funding tends to follow the lemming principle. So you have investors who chase after whatever the hot topic of the moment is. And right now, everyone is looking for software startups, the so-called unicorns. And if you're looking at a hard technology firm that is not a software startup, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. That does not to say it's impossible. It's just going to be outside of what a lot of conventional venture investors are looking for. Bootstrapping, another way of thinking about being lean, which is that you fund the company again, from kind of internal sources. Look for early opportunities to get revenues. One of the things we've actually been successful with is getting non-recurring engineering expenditures, so-called NREs, from strategic partners, from strategic players. So these are large companies that will pay the startup or the spin out to develop the product. Kind of an interesting concept. And again, just this idea of capital efficiency. Now, one of the countervailing factors here is speed. So if you do have more capital, you're able to get to market more quickly. The extra capital can be wasted, but if used effectively, it does allow you to get to market more quickly. So it's not as easy as just saying we're going to be efficient, lean. You do have to balance it around the dynamics of the specific business that you're looking at. Equity versus cash, this is the idea of using equity to incent and to pay some of the early founders and resources that you bring to the company. Again, that equity is expensive to you. It's something that you as the founder or the initial backer of the company think is very valuable, so you'd rather not have to give it away. But if you don't have any cash, it is something you can give away, and you can be careful about how you do that. But it is another option that's out there. And of course, universities do often have a lot of infrastructure that helps a spin out or a startup be lean. And often these things are not used as much as they should be, or we've spoken to a lot of faculty members who aren't particularly aware of the kinds of programs and services that are available. Let's look a little bit at different kinds of funding sources. The most traditional, particularly early on, you've got so these are the founders of the companies. In many cases, in university spin-out, then we're talking about university faculty. These are not generally people who have multi-million-dollar portfolios that allow them to invest huge amounts of capital in the business, but it is an option. There are ways to do that. We think that tends to work better for generic startups versus spin-outs, and we did have a webinar a couple of months ago about the difference between the two. But in the case of the spin-out, there's probably less of that kind of funding, although the university behind that spin-out often does have pockets of money that can fill this early gap. Loans, very hard to get debt into the capital structure of a spin-out without a track record, but there are different kinds of programs. We're even aware of SBA in the United States, the Small Business Administration, having provided some fairly early loans just because they were able to pitch it well, and the founders were able to pitch it well and create a compelling case. In different jurisdictions, so whether at the national level, different countries have different kinds of programs, also different states or provinces, and even municipalities have programs. We list that there at the end, the different kinds of government programs. They can be in the way of loans or equity investments or even non-dilutive capital sources. Family, friends, acquaintances, angel investors, and then the traditional venture capital. But you note that venture capital here is one in a laundry list, and particularly at the seed stage, it's not one that we encourage people to bet on, because traditional venture capital firms increasingly don't like very, very early stage companies.
Right. In fact, we've often heard venture capital firms respond to early spin-out ideas with things like come back when you have a product or come back when you have revenue, which may feel like a catch-22 because it takes funding to get to that level. But the key point here is that there are many less obvious sources for early seed round funding. And I would say for those of you, whether you're coming from the tech transfer office or from the faculty side of the equation, acknowledge these catch-22s. There are a lot of them in the spin-out and startup business. They're all over the place, and they can be extremely frustrating. And so we always encourage people to acknowledge that those catch-22s exist, and then you work through them. But if you pretend that they don't, all you're going to do is frustrate yourself. So less obvious sources. At Opus Faveo, this is something that we tend to think about quite a bit. We like these non-traditional sources.
because again, what you want ultimately is flexibility. You want lots of different potential sources of capital, and you want to be in a situation where you have more capital sources being thrown at you than you need, and being in the situation of not really needing any one particular source of capital. That puts you in a much stronger position to negotiate better terms and valuation and so on. So just to touch on these, customers, suppliers, we talked about these NRE types of dollars that are out there. Customers who want to be able to buy your product, suppliers who want to be able to supply to your company because your company is going to be this great new customer for them, and so they're willing to invest in that. Crowdsourcing has gotten a lot of press recently. Don't overestimate what's available there. There tends to be a pretty spiky distribution, so you end up with these big success stories and a lot of things that don't do so well. But again, it is something that's out there and it's of interest, and depending on the country you're in, there are different kinds of crowdsourcing vehicles that you'd want to look at. University stuff, there again, across the university ecosystem there's so much, and one of the big problems that we see over and over again is that the key people who are going to be behind a spin out are just not aware of all the programs that the university has in place. So if you're on the TTO side of things, or even VP research, make sure that you're doing a good job and look for opportunities to do an even better job at communicating what you're doing, what you have in your ecosystem in a fairly straightforward manner. Consulting, this is the idea that you do kind of aligned work, and it can be consulting, and it can be even early products, things that generate revenue before you get to the real meat of what you're trying to do in the startup. And then finally, all this non-cash stuff, and this is where university spin-outs have such a tremendous advantage. These non-cash, we often talk about in the university setting, the soft power that the university can deploy to help a spin-out, and conventional startups outside the university setting just don't have access to all of that.
Okay, so now to just kind of recap, what are the key ideas here for researchers and for universities? First, thinking about researchers or faculty members who are interested in using their technology as the basis to start a spin-out. A couple of things here. First, start early. Be thinking about spin-out as a goal as you're developing research plans and as you're thinking about the direction your research takes. Pay attention to hot topics in your industry, both scientific, of course, but also within the business literature. And what's going on with the way that technology is being applied in the business world. And think about the commercialization potential coming out of your IP development plan. One of the key points we made early on was to invest the time in planning and building the business and thinking about the markets, the competition, and so on before you start fundraising, so that you're really prepared to answer the questions that will come up during the fundraising round. Cultivate potential investors, begin approaching them to get them interested in the technology. Usually it takes a number of contacts before an investor becomes willing to invest. So you kind of have to bring them along, especially when you're talking about technology that people may initially be less familiar with, and where there's some innovation involved that means taking a technology in a new direction. Tap into all the multiple sources of funding, not just the traditional ones, but some of the other ones that Christian mentioned, and leverage the assets that the university provides through the tech transfer office, through the business school, through the alumni, and through things like most universities have accelerators and other mechanisms to enable them to get started. And if you're fortunate enough that your university has some form of seed fund available, tap into that as well.
Shifting over to the university administration, TTO, VP research side of the equation, not the faculty, which David just covered, but on the other side of the campus or the fence here. The first and probably the most important is to really establish spin-outs as a goal for the institution. the institution wants to see spinouts and sees the value. We actually spend a lot of time looking at the value of spinouts, and we've done a lot of research on this. We think they provide a lot of impact in the broader community. So we think they're an important part of this, but every university needs to decide this obviously for themselves. But if it is valuable, then you really need to establish that throughout the institution. Look at the approach. One of the things that happens, and we actually think it's a fairly natural outcome, is that the TTO can be adversarial vis-a-vis the underlying spin-out, the technologists, PhD students, faculty, etc. There's that natural dynamic that happens. So look at that and say to yourself, how can we change that dynamic? How can we put in other procedures so that we still protect the university, do all the things that lead to this natural dynamic, but also encourage the spin-out? That's not an easy balance. We have a number of things that we recommend and work with universities around, but it's important. Find those rockstar researchers. We've spoken to universities, highly ranked research universities, that say, well, all of our faculty are rock stars. And yet the reality is there are always those that the university administration can identify as being the ones who are most interested in creating spin-outs and who have the most potential to create successful companies of the sort. And once you find them, groom them, work with them to try to develop these sorts of things. Benchmark programs, benchmarking. We're big believers in data, and we encourage people. We do a lot of this work on behalf of universities. Encourage you to look at your peers, look at best in class, and look at how you're doing compared to the others that are out there. Develop the capabilities to vet technologies. Again, that can be in the tech transfer office, but to the extent you've got that adversarial dynamic, be aware of it and try to work around that. Potential investors and alumni. This is a tremendous opportunity in the university setting. It takes time, it takes effort. It takes a lot of work with the development office, because the development office will in general be skeptical of any effort to divert capital that might go to the university to a spin out. And yet we think it's a 1 + 1 = 3 sort of situation. We think you can actually bring a lot more capital to the university and create a lot more impact by cultivating alumni as investors. And again, cultivating investors who aren't necessarily alumni before you actually need to tap into them with a specific spin out. Silos, you're all very aware of the silo problem in universities. We see it over and over again, particularly between the hard science side of the university and the business school. So if you can try to connect those and break down those silos, that really can help. And then finally, again, this concept of soft power. All of the indirect, non-cash ways that the university can encourage and support spin-outs create a tremendous advantage for them versus other kinds of startup companies. So, going back to Sutton's Law, obvious, well, in some ways, yes, it's obvious you need money, but there are some non-obvious things that are kind of underneath. Non-obvious sources of capital. Go after them, develop them, cultivate them, and ideally even before you actually need them. Money's good, but actually you want less, not more. And finally, the idea that you're not building this company just to raise money. You're building the company to build the company. And that gets lost particularly in frothy areas like, let's say, cybersecurity right now. You want to build a company to build a company. And then be aware that faculty, administrators, students all have different goals. They're coming at all of this from the same place, but there's a lot of harmony as well. There's a lot of opportunity, or a lot of crossover, into a lot of opportunity to align everyone's interests. So this is really our concluding variation on Sutton's Law. Why do we create spinouts? Well, spinouts is where you can really develop the most societal impact, and ultimately the university is about, we think, about creating societal impact in all kinds of ways, and it's just a terrific place to create companies. So with that, we are done with today's webinar. We do hope that this has been helpful and informative, and encourage you to reach out to us. The email address here, info@opusfaveo.com. And we love working with universities. We love spinouts. We have a lot of experience all the way around this space, and we do it because we think it's important. We think it's important societally. Getting good at this creates jobs, it creates economic growth, and creates terrific societal or solutions to societal problems. We are happy to do a variety of things for universities. We will certainly consult with you about a specific spin-out opportunity or a specific question. We'll be happy to have a partner with Opus Faveo spend an hour with you by phone. And then we have a number of programs that you can look at on our website, and custom programs that can help universities move this stuff along. David, anything else from your front?
No, I think that covers it, Christian. I'd just like to say thank you all for listening, and stay tuned for future webinars. You can find more at our website, and we look forward to hearing from you on any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thanks, and have a good rest of the day.